Hello friends, my name is JJ, and why are we so obsessed with Mormons? The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives is but the latest manifestation of a cultural fixation that has already included a Broadway musical, multiple other TV shows, a vast array of Mormon-related podcasts, and endless Mormon-themed videos here on YouTube. Clearly, there is something about them that provokes this endless curiosity, something about this small and distinctly American religion that feels like it is always just out of reach of being understood by non-Mormons. And I think that is partially because the story of what Mormonism even is tends to be told in such a frustratingly incomplete way. In my experience, the traditional summary goes something like this. 200 years ago, there was some guy named Joseph Smith, and he invented a new flavor of Christianity called Mormonism based on some golden plates he claimed to have received from an angel of the Lord. He was an odd guy, but a lot of people believed him, and yada yada yada. There are now millions of Mormons following the teachings of a book based on Joseph Smith's golden plates. My problem with this way of telling Mormon history is, as Jerry Seinfeld once put it,
but you yada yada over the best part.
I mean, I get why people are so fascinated by the tale of Joseph Smith and the golden plates. It's a wild story, and as the Mormon Church itself often explicitly says, the entire justification for the Mormon religion rests on the premise that Joseph Smith was telling the truth. I recently read this famous book, the CES Letter, which is considered the most comprehensive debunking of Mormonism ever written, and even it is mostly about Joseph Smith. Any references to the modern church mostly come in the form of noting how it has just doubled down on Joseph Smith's original claims. In this video, however, I want to do something different. I don't want to talk about Joseph Smith, but rather what happened to the Mormon Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, after he died in 1844. Specifically, I want to talk about the 16 men who served as prophets of the Mormon Church after Joseph Smith. This is something that a lot of non-Mormons are often surprised to learn. The fact that Joseph Smith was not the only Mormon prophet, but was just the first in a string of living prophets, and there is even a living Mormon prophet today. So, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is organized in a very hierarchical way, with the current living prophet serving as president of the church, and then a vast assortment of underlings below. Mormons are taught to venerate their prophet even more explicitly than Catholics venerate the Pope, because the Mormon prophet, as his title suggests, has the ability to communicate directly with God and impart new rules from God to the public, just as Joseph Smith did with his golden plates 200 years ago. If you visit the homes of Mormon families, they will often have a picture of the prophet on display somewhere. And when I was in Salt Lake City recently, I went to a Mormon bookstore, and you can see they were selling all sorts of photos of the prophet and his various pals. Mormons tend to always refer to their prophet as President so-and-so.
In representing Jesus Christ as his modern-day prophet, President Russell M. Nelson.
Our beloved prophet, President Russell M. Nelson.
We give thanks for President Nelson and
how righteous President Nelson is.
We will strengthen our glorious President Nelson.
With this fixation on the title of president, almost certainly a remnant of Joseph Smith's desire to become president of the United States someday, though these days Mormons are very fixated on the title of president in general, and a surprising number of people in the lesser hierarchy are called president too. The Mormon prophet has 12 apostles, just like Jesus Christ, although unlike Jesus, they carry over from one prophet to another, often serving for many decades. The longest serving apostle of all serves as the chairman of what they call the Quorum of the 12, and when the prophet dies, he becomes the new prophet. What this means in practice is that the Mormon prophets tend to be extremely old. The current prophet, President Russell M. Nelson recently turned 100, and the guy who is next in line is 92. This in turn helps explain why the Mormon Church is so famously conservative. Its leaders are by definition always several generations behind in the times. At the present rate, it will be a while before the Mormons even have a prophet born after World War II, for instance. So when I was in Salt Lake, I bought this charming little set of posters of all of the different Mormon prophets. I think they're supposed to be like for a Mormon classroom or something. And you can see that each one is illustrated with a little montage around the prophet's face, showing the various things that he was known for. So let us now go through them, and I will tell you what you're supposed to know about each guy. In studying these prophets, I have relied on both Mormon and non-Mormon sources. The LDS Church produces a lot of authorized history about the prophets that is very detailed, but obviously biased, while a lot of ex-Mormon or non-Mormon sources are less detailed but more objective or critical. I put some of my sources in the description if you are craving more than just a superficial overview, but my goal for this video is to just try to explain the gist of these men, their relevance to the LDS Church, the Mormon religion, and in some cases, America itself. So Joseph Smith was killed in 1844 by an angry mob who had invaded the jail cell where he was being held in Carthage, Illinois. You can learn about how he got there from somebody else's video. But in any case, after his murder, the Mormons needed to pick someone else to lead their church, which by then had about 20,000 followers in the American Midwest, and the person they settled on was Brigham Young, a carpenter from rural New York who had risen to become Joseph Smith's right-hand man. Apparently, things were settled when, during a debate over who should be the next church leader, Brigham Young gave a passionate speech where he literally transformed into Joseph Smith himself.
Brigham Young, who was the president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, arose to speak when the mantle of Joseph fell upon him, and he was like one transformed. His countenance, voice, and form were like those of the late prophet. Many in the congregation, even children, saw this miracle. It satisfied the people and decided the question, who was to be the leader?
After Joseph Smith, Brigham Young is probably the Mormon prophet that the greatest number of non-Mormons have heard of, as you can see from the covered wagons in this picture here. He is best known for leading the early Mormons on a long trek out of the Midwest, which had become very anti-Mormon, and into the Utah desert, which in those days was still part of Mexico. Settling his followers in this unpopulated area, Brigham Young proclaimed himself governor of the state of Deseret, and he served for the next 30 years as a competent and effective architect of a thriving new American colony based around a new city known as Salt Lake. In 1848, America annexed Utah from Mexico, and Brigham Young applied to get his colony, whose borders he defined a little generously, admitted to the United States. The Congress whittled it way down and said it could only be a territory, the territory of Utah, though in a significant concession, the federal government agreed to recognize Young as the legal governor. Now, in his later years, Joseph Smith had told his inner circle that God wanted them to become polygamists. And knowing it would be controversial, this doctrine of plural marriage was initially a closely guarded secret of the Mormon elite, who nevertheless embraced it with gusto. Joseph Smith would take 34 wives, while Brigham Young would take, by some estimates, 57. In 1852, however, Brigham Young went public and announced to the world that God wanted Mormons to be polygamists. No longer an awkward secret, polygamy quickly became an open and even proud part of Mormon identity, which in turn quickly made the LDS Church hugely unpopular with the rest of the country. These days, most Americans think of polygamy as kind of ridiculous and maybe a little creepy, but in the 1850s, when sexual norms were extremely uptight, polygamy was considered almost impossibly perverted and repulsive. The idea of a man openly having so many sexual partners was sickening, as was the age gap between some of the Mormon men and their young wives. Many moral crusaders of the time actually considered polygamy as offensive to the natural order as slavery, and often spoke of it in the same breath. And because of this, the notion of a bizarre Mormon theocracy emerging in Utah became increasingly frightening to many Americans. Since the Mormon religion was seen as so grotesque, the idea of this church running a sizable chunk of the United States was seen as deeply offensive to the proper American constitutional system of secular government. President James Buchanan was particularly offended, and he spent a considerable portion of his first State of the Union denouncing Brigham Young as a despicable tyrant who had established absolute power over both church and state in his corner of the continent. And this led to what is sometimes called the Utah War, or the Mormon War. Though no shots were actually fired, Buchanan simply dispatched thousands of troops to the Utah border and threatened to invade. And in early 1858, Brigham Young agreed to step down as governor. A non-Mormon governor was installed, and the US Army set up a giant fort just outside of Salt Lake City, which lasted into the Civil War years. On that note, the other big thing about Brigham Young that has to be mentioned, because next to the polygamy, it would prove to be the single biggest issue for the church, was his incredible racism. Even by the standards of his time, Young had very hateful and violent opinions about black people, believing them to be unfit to be anything beyond slaves or servants. As governor, he legalized slavery in Utah, and as Mormon president, he introduced a policy declaring that black people, or indeed anyone with black ancestry, was unfit to hold office in the LDS Church hierarchy, serve as a missionary, or enter a Mormon temple. African Americans could join the church, but could not enjoy the full benefits of membership, such as having their marriages receive a temple blessing, which is a very important thing in Mormon theology. Brigham Young died in 1877, having served as Mormon prophet for almost 3 decades. He is very much the founding father of Mormon Utah, and in that sense is one of the most unique and consequential figures in the history of the United States, arguably even more so than Joseph Smith himself. The third prophet was a guy named John Taylor, the only foreign-born prophet. He was from England and emigrated to Canada in his 20s, where he was converted by an early Mormon missionary. He moved to the US and became an apostle of Joseph Smith and later Brigham Young, eventually becoming chairman of the Quorum of the 12. And since this was the position that Brigham Young had held when Joseph Smith had died, it was agreed that so too should Taylor become the new prophet now that Brigham Young was dead. And thus has been Mormon tradition ever since. So with slavery having been abolished by the Civil War, America's progressive reformers now turned their attention to polygamy, and this once again made Utah public enemy number 1 in the eyes of Washington, D.C. Congress began passing harsher and harsher anti-polygamy laws, many of which targeted Utah specifically. It culminated in an 1887 bill that outright dissolved the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as a legal entity and allowed the federal government to seize its assets. Senior Mormon leaders became wanted men and were either jailed or went into hiding, including President Taylor, who spent much of his 6-year leadership of the church in an undisclosed location, communicating only through letters. When Taylor died in 1887, he was replaced by Wilford Woodruff, an 82-year-old man who knew that things could not continue on like this. The Mormon religion could not survive with its leaders being enemies of the state, its church being forcibly disassembled, and the community of Utah under perpetual occupation by federal marshals. Was polygamy really worth all of this? So in 1890, President Woodruff announced that the Lord had revealed unto him that polygamy was to be phased out among members of the church. This became known as Official Declaration 1, and it was added to the Book of Doctrines and Covenants, one of the 3 books of sacred Mormon scriptures. You will notice, though, that I said phased out rather than banned. Most of the Mormon men who had multiple wives by this point, including many church elites, only started splitting up with them very gradually, and well into the 20th century, the church would face criticism for not cracking down on the practice of polygamy harshly enough. Fundamentalist Mormons, on the other hand, felt that Woodruff had committed blasphemy, and accordingly, over the next few decades, rival prophets would spring up, claiming you could still do polygamy if you followed them. If you ever hear about a Mormon having multiple wives in the modern era, they are almost certainly following some fringe dissident prophet. Beyond that, President Woodruff was also the first prophet to go on the record explicitly rejecting a Mormon theocracy, either in Utah, as Brigham Young had done, or over the entire United States, as Joseph Smith had wanted to do back in his day. There has not been, or is there, the remotest desire on our part, or on the part of our co-religionists, to do anything looking to a union of church and state, was how he put it. These two reforms went a long way to help alleviate anxieties in Washington about Mormon-run Utah, and in 1896, Utah officially became the 45th state of the US, symbolized here by the Utah State Seal. Beyond that, President Woodruff was also the prophet who presided over the completion of the enormous Mormon temple in the center of Salt Lake City, which to this day functions as the sacred meeting place of the Mormon prophets and their apostles. And he was the prophet who instigated the church's preoccupation with genealogy. Most of the major genealogy firms in America are run by Mormons because of a decree that President Woodruff made that Mormons should seek to document everyone who had ever lived and baptize them into the Mormon Church posthumously. Woodruff died in 1898 and was replaced by Lorenzo Snow, who only served 3 years, but in my opinion was one of the top 3 most important prophets of all time because he was the guy who introduced the concept of tithing. Tithing is a traditional Old Testament practice where you're supposed to give some portion of your personal wealth to the Lord. And by the 1890s, the LDS Church had racked up a lot of debt from spending so much on temples and missionaries and legal battles with the federal government. So President Snow had a vision from God that he wanted Mormons to start giving 10% of their yearly income to the church to help sustain it financially. And because the Mormons were very loyal to their prophet, the vast majority obediently did this, and still do this to this day. This flooded the church with an enormous amount of cash, which in turn allowed it to enter the 20th century as a much more serious and sophisticated religious operation than it had been in the 19th century. Snow died in 1901 and was replaced by Joseph F. Smith, the first prophet who was born into the church rather than being an adult convert. And this was because he was the original Joseph Smith's nephew. The Smith family was highly venerated in Mormon circles, but Joseph Smith's widow and Brigham Young didn't get along, so she didn't go to Utah, and her son, Joseph Smith III, wound up becoming prophet of a different flavor of Mormonism based out of the Midwest, what is now known as the Community of Christ. Joseph F. Smith was the son of Joseph Smith's older brother, who had been murdered in prison alongside him, and his widowed mother brought him to Utah, where he was part of the first generation of American children to be raised Mormon. He was appointed one of Brigham Young's apostles when he was in his 20s. As president, he is probably best known for his 1906 decree that from henceforth, not all Mormon converts should come to Utah. The Mormons had had an active missionary program from the very beginning, but the way it generally worked was that after somebody converted to Mormonism, they would move to Utah and live there for the rest of their lives. This was partially to be surrounded by a community of believers, but also for practical reasons. Mormonism places a lot of emphasis on doing certain rituals in a Mormon temple, and for a long time, Utah was the only place in the world where Mormon temples existed. Joseph F. Smith, however, declared it would be better for the long-term spread of Mormonism if converts stayed put and created Mormon communities outside of just a single American state. This heralded a shift in the church's focus, and it began to prioritize the creation of Mormon temples not just all across the US, but all over the world as well. Smith died in 1918 and was replaced by Heber J. Grant, the second prophet to be born into the faith and the first prophet born in Utah, which has also been the case for almost every prophet after him. Grant's ascension thus represented a significant shift in the leadership of the church, away from pioneer-era converts who had known Joseph Smith or Brigham Young personally, and towards men who grew up in a Utah that was now a more or less fully developed place, with cities and jobs and industries not that different from other states. Grant had been a successful Utah businessman who, like many Utah businessmen in the late 19th century, was also very active in church affairs, not because he was trying to build some exciting new religion from scratch, but just because that was the religion of the community he was born into, and being a diligent Mormon was just part of that culture. As prophet, he embodied a similarly modern sensibility, making use of the newfangled technology of radio, as we see here, in order to communicate directly with his people and project an image of a church that was aware of public concerns and engaged with the happenings of the wider world. During his long presidency, which lasted for 26 years, the second longest after Brigham Young, the LDS Church closed in on 1 million members and became more modern, professionalized, and bureaucratic, while still remaining loyal to an increasingly stable set of Mormon beliefs. He notably got the church a lot more involved in charity and humanitarian work, provoked by the suffering inflicted by the 2 world wars and the Great Depression. A weird anachronism is that Grant was also the last prophet to have been a polygamist, since he was a young man right before the decree against it came in. Grant died just a few days after VE Day on May 14th, 1945. He was replaced by another member of the Smith family, George Smith, who was a more distant relative of Joseph, but still grew up in a very well-connected Mormon family. George Smith presided over the post-war growth of the LDS Church into something increasingly designed to accommodate, and some might say dominate, the lives of middle-class Mormon families in Utah, with all sorts of church-sponsored businesses and magazines and sports teams and social clubs that allowed Mormons to enjoy all of the benefits of modern American culture, while nevertheless feeling secure that they were always being surrounded by other pious members of the faith. George died and was replaced in 1951 by David O. McKay, who basically continued this same agenda. Growing post-war incomes and birth rates were making the LDS Church steadily wealthier through the tithe system, which allowed the post-war church to get increasingly ambitious. The church could soon afford to set up missionary campaigns in even the most remote corners of the world, and they were finally able to fully fund the construction of overseas temples to serve as the center of non-American Mormon communities. President McKay, in fact, dedicated the church's first 3 overseas temples during his reign in Switzerland, New Zealand, and London. He was in turn replaced in 1970 by yet another member of the Smith family, Joseph Fielding Smith. The earlier prophet, Joseph F. Smith, was his father and was actually named Joseph Fielding Smith as well. But to keep things less confusing, Mormons only call the second Joseph F. Smith by his full name. Joseph Fielding Smith is a major figure in Mormon history because he was a highly venerated and prolific church-authorized writer on the topic of Mormon theology. He was thus largely responsible for helping clarify what exactly late 20th century Mormons believed. The greatest doctrinal teacher of his generation, says his poster. What he argued in his many best-selling Mormon books, which we see here, was that Mormons should be very conservative Christians. They should read the Bible in a very literal way and be very skeptical of the secular ideas of the modern world. This included everything from rejecting the theory of evolution, to opposing the corrupting influences of Hollywood, to encouraging women to be mothers and homemakers before anything else. As a prophet in his 90s, in the early 1970s, Joseph Fielding Smith issued declarations that placed the LDS Church on the conservative side of the many contentious culture war battles of the time, denouncing birth control, abortion, homosexuality, rock music, and the rest. Smith died in 1973 and was replaced by Harold B. Lee, a longtime church bureaucrat who was nevertheless a pretty irrelevant prophet because he died after just 17 months on the job. In 1973, Lee was replaced by Spencer W. Kimball, the last prophet we're going to talk about today. And this is because he was the last prophet who made any substantial changes to the core beliefs of the Mormon Church. He was the 20th century prophet who had to address the greatest remaining controversy of the church's 19th century history. I refer, of course, to the whole black people thing. The Mormon Church's ban on full rights for its black members had become increasingly controversial during the civil rights era, when all of the major institutions of American life were desegregating. Mormon scholars, likewise, were beginning to conclude that the ban was just a product of Brigham Young's personal bigotry and the racism of subsequent church leaders, and never had been justified by any claims of divine revelation. To a man like Kimball, who really wanted to step up the church's missionary work, the ban was similarly an obvious obstacle to broadening Mormonism's appeal in the non-white world. And lastly, there was fear that history would repeat itself and that the federal government would move to strip legal protections from the church, just as it had done during the polygamy era. So by the late 1970s, there was a broad consensus that the ban had to go, and in June of 1978, President Kimball declared that he had received a vision from the Lord that blacks should now enjoy full rights and membership in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. You can see a black guy receiving a full blessing right here. Much like the polygamy ban, this vision was considered so important that it was added to the Mormon scriptures as official declaration to the last addition to the Mormon canon to date. People are often very cynical about this revelation because it was so obviously done for political reasons, but that also makes it an important case study in how the church was being run by this point. As this excellent book, Second Class Saints by Matthew Harris, discusses at great length, Kimball didn't change the policy on black members unilaterally. It was rather something that he discussed and negotiated with other church elites, forging a gradual consensus, with the eventual announcement of the policy as a divine revelation being a bit of a ceremonial formality, as opposed to a literal description of how the decision was made. In other words, the Mormon Church was now operating as a sophisticated bureaucracy where the big decisions were being made by the prophets and apostles working together as executives, reaching consensus decisions that were in the best interests of their organization. Things had come a long way from the authoritarian one-man rule of Joseph Smith or Brigham Young. Mormons were now a thoroughly modern 20th century church, perhaps not that much different from other Protestant denominations. Kimball served as president for 7 more years after his doctrine-changing revelation, but didn't do anything else nearly as noteworthy. He died in 1985, a time when, according to his poster, the church had risen to almost 6 million members worldwide. There have been 5 prophets after Kimball, all of whom served as apostles under him and have been mostly similar to one another. Benson, Hunter, Hinckley, Monson, and now Nelson have all been university-educated church technocrats with charming and avuncular personalities, but serious and conservative beliefs about traditional church doctrines. They've presided over a rapidly expanding church that has become steadily more international in its identity, including a membership of over 17 million that is now majority non-American. But the rise of the internet has also seen a growing proliferation of anti-Mormon content online, which has driven many young people from the church like never before. Prophets are still leaders, but now serve as increasingly defensive spokesmen for a church that the world is more curious about than ever, and not always in a good way. At least this is how I see it, as an outsider looking in. For anyone who grew up Mormon, I'd be curious to hear what you think defines the last few prophets, as well as what you were taught about the various historic prophets. And for my non-Mormon viewers, I would be curious to know if any of you guys have heard of any of these people at all. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, subscribe for more, and I will see you next week.